We good? Okay, where's my clicker? I think this will work. Just to let you guys know, I'm going to be teaching off and on for the next 2-3 months. I'll be teaching this week and next week. Then Bill Dover, I believe, is coming back to finish his last class on Amos. Then Dan Casco is going to teach for 2 weeks because I'm going to be gone. And then when I come back, I'm going to continue what I'm teaching now. In general, this class that I'm going to be teaching is going to be on Exodus chapter 20. But we're going to do a little bit of groundwork first, so there's no need really to turn in your Bibles today. We're going to be talking about some things to get us ready for it. All right. There we go. All right, take a look at this statement. The highest possible stage in moral culture is when we recognize that we ought to control our thoughts. Agree or disagree? Not necessarily. This was spoken by Charles Darwin, who proposed that morality was a byproduct of evolution. In other words, morality is a human trait that arose as a natural selection shaped man into a highly social species. And the capacity of morality, Darwin argued, lay in the small, subtle differences between us and our closest animal relatives. Another quote. I distinguish between the capacity of ethics, which is biologically determined as a result of biological evolution, and the moral codes or ethical norms, which are largely outcomes of cultural evolution, including religious beliefs. Now, this was actually made by a Catholic priest who is also a scientist. What I want to show today is just what is involved in modern ethics and modern morality and how it's viewed, not by biblical people like what we are here, what we believe, but by much of the world, whether they know it or not. It's subtly something that has changed over time before our very eyes, and we don't even really, a lot of times, realize it. This guy here, this Francesco, says in his statement, what he's basically saying is that ethics is biological and morals are cultural, and accordingly, ethics were born out of how mankind evolved through biology, and morals, on the other hand, are what culture dictate. He agrees with that first statement by Darwin. And basically, this is the old, if you've ever taken psychology, the nature versus nurture idea. Another way to state this is that evolution favored increased intelligence, but as humans gained that intelligence, we began to consider the consequences of our actions and were able to choose cooperative, moral living. And eventually, human societies created laws, moral codes, and religion, all of which were subject to cultural evolution that operated separately, yet in tandem with biological evolution. But if you think about it, of any of the classes that you've had on me with Christian evidences, that kind of runs counter to the second law of thermodynamics. Things don't go from better to good to better, they are from worse to better, they go from better to worse. That's a provable fact. At its root, what does this really imply? What many people do not understand is just how the assumption of the absence of a creator changes our whole outlook on human behavior. If you look at this right here, upper left corner, you'll see a little simple circuit. I started learning to read these circuits when I was quite young because my dad was an electronics person, and if we wanted something that was electronic, we didn't go out and buy it, we had to make it. Dad always had extra spare parts because he worked on TVs and radios, and Dad says, okay, you want this amplifier? Here's a schematic. You know what to do. So when I had my first electric guitar, I had to build my own amplifier. Top one, most everybody in here ought to recognize. It's simply a power source like a battery, a switch, and a light. And if it's turned on, light goes on. If it turns off, then the light goes off. The second one there is a lot more complicated. In that second one, I recognize symbols for capacitors and resistors and coils and transistors and microprocessors and wires. What that circuit does, I don't know, but it was pre-programmed by someone to do something. Somebody had to design it. It didn't come about by accident. Electrical and pneumatic systems are pre-programmed to respond in specific ways. Yes, some code written for something like a computer, for instance, can allow for what is called artificial intelligence. But still, the machine was originally created by someone or some kind of outside intelligence that gave it that ability. Science right now is trying to tell us that machines can learn, machines can get smarter, and therefore evolution can be true because we can make it happen with machines. But that's nonsense because they had to design the machine to do it. Okay? There still had to be this spark. But remember, classical Darwinism, the evolutional idea of Darwinism begins with absolutely no intelligence at all. If you look at a modern chart, like one of these, and everybody's probably seen one of these, showing the evolutionary process, no one seems to notice that something important is missing. What's missing?
The beginning.
The beginning. We're actually a long ways into the evolutionary process, should it be true, if this is actually accurate, which of course I don't believe it is. Or we could go to one that's a little more complicated like this one. This chart goes even further back. And if you'll notice in these red circles here, as we go back, we go from mammals back to, we starting at the right, going to the left, going back to reptiles, and then back to fishes, and then back to invertebrates, and then finally back to protozoa. And protozoa is defined as a single-celled organism. So this chart begins with life, like the other one does. It goes back farther, but the question should be asked, what happened before that single cell? And evolutionary charts always begin with life. I remember seeing a debate between Bill O'Reilly and Richard Dawkins. And if you don't remember, Richard Dawkins, of course, is a staunch evolutionist. And even though I do not agree religiously hardly at all with O'Reilly, what he was trying to get Dawkins to do at that point was to say, how did we all get here from the beginning? And Dawkins would just dodge the question, and he never would say, because he can't. He doesn't know. He doesn't care. Evolutionary charts begin with life. Classical evolutionary theory does not concern itself with this, even though at one point they had what's called the Miller-Urey experiment. I remember studying that when I was in high school, ever so briefly. I've read several books since, specifically one that's most important that says this experiment, no matter what they say, can't work. But this experiment was designed and is still used in textbooks as a way that life can be sparked without other life. Of course, who built the test tubes and caused the spark? That's another story. But even if that was true, this experiment really doesn't work. But they still try to tell you that it does. Imagine a rock. or some kind of other inert matter, because evolution has to start with something. They can't start with a vacuum, because if everything was a real vacuum, total vacuum, and there was nothing, there'd still be nothing. So they have to start with something. So they start with matter. And for sake of argument, when I do this, I start with a rock, because it's matter, and it works real well with my illustration. Now, imagine this rock or some other kind of matter becoming not only animated, but also becoming feeling and thinking being over time. In other words, even if a rock could somehow be able to take on life and have movement over billions of years, it still cannot think or feel. So how can this inert piece of matter learn to think and make rational decisions, know the difference between right and wrong, and feel happiness and sorrow? Evolution has to explain this. They have to explain this. On the surface, that seems highly unlikely. In fact, it even seems silly. What mechanism could possibly exist that could allow non-intelligence to breed intelligence? I mean, we must begin with zero intelligence, not a single iota of brain power, no mind, no psyche, no reasoning, nothing. If a computer is given a program in the form of written lines of code, then it can carry out tasks that the author of the software decides. So, I forgot that one right there. Rocks for brains. Sorry. So we've got a couple of examples here. The word processor is built specifically by a programmer to format words and writings. Photo editing software has been pre-programmed to manipulate images taken with a camera, or an industrial machine has some kind of specific work that it needs to do that the programmers have given it. And those lines of code in the upper left, even though the little zeros and ones and the little words that might be involved in certain languages might be different, but it's the same kind of code. It has to be written in order for the computer to do anything. But how would a rock ever know, when there's no intelligence anywhere in the universe, ever know how to make things or appreciate art, or to speak or write a single word? There had to have been some code. Who would have written the code that allows the rock to think, since there is no outside intelligence with which to design the necessary systems? This was a major problem that modern evolutionary thinkers back in the 19th century had to overcome. Otherwise, their theory couldn't be taken serious. And then there had to be a solution to this problem, otherwise their theory would have collapsed. The solution came from, anybody know? The fields of electricity and chemistry. When you first study human behavior in classes like psychology, initially you are told that all thoughts, feelings, and other intellect are transferred through the body as electrical impulses and or chemical changes. And there is truth to this. It happens this way. The scientist can verify this in the lab. We know, for instance, in a nervous system, that the synapse is structured that permits a neuron or a nerve cell to pass an electrical charge or chemical signal to another neuron or to target some other part of the cell. Therefore, if science could come up with an initial spark of electricity or first chemical reaction, then the building blocks of human thought and emotion, according to their theory, would possibly be attainable without any kind of outside intellectual force. And that brings us back to the statement made by the scientist Catholic priest Francesco Alea that we mentioned earlier. Ethics could now, if this is true, be formulated through biology, and once ethics were made possible, then moral code could, through society's social and cultural norms, be made over time. Once this kind of thinking was accepted, and it was way earlier than nowadays, it was accepted probably over 100 years ago, it's crept into our society in ways that most people don't even realize anymore right now. Once this is accepted, then the way we think about all human endeavors would need to be altered in order to conform with this new way of describing human behavior. This is what happened throughout the mid-1800s. It is no coincidence that the ideas of Dewey, Freud, Keynes, Marx, Nietzsche, and Wellhausen all became highly influential in that same part of the 19th century, in the mid-1800s, at a time when Darwinism was born and began to rise to prominence. Once that genie was let out of the box, there was no putting it back. And as a result, the world saw a huge paradigm shift. Here are the people that I just mentioned. Dewey was important in education. Freud, of course, in human behavior and responsibility. Keynes in economics. Karl Marx, social and governmental systems. Philosophy, Nietzsche was the guy that said God is dead. And Wellhausen, of course, is the guy we've talked about in some of my classes recently a lot. It's been mentioned here off and on over the years, with his biblical interpretation and documentary hypothesis that basically says that the people that wrote the Bible couldn't have written it, that it was done much later, therefore they weren't miracles. These 6 guys, and some of them are highly regarded even by Christians, okay? Dewey, Keynesian economics, we've been on Keynesian economics since probably at least JFK, maybe before, but every one of these 6 were all influenced by the same guy, Charles Darwin. In fact, there's a book out that I've read before called 7 Men Who Rule the World from the Grave by David Breeze, and explains these connections. So, all of these men took their cue from the evolutionary model of Charles Darwin. And I already said that. Every field of human endeavor became, in some way, influenced by this new way of looking at the beginning of mankind's existence. All of a sudden, not only had Homo erectus become reclassified as simply the next rung of the evolutionary ladder, but our mental abilities had been reclassified to nothing more than a series of random accidents somehow performed on a mindless piece of matter by no other intelligence. Because no other intelligence existed in the beginning. What did this kind of thinking do to our sense of right and wrong in our societies in the last 150 years? Where has the responsibility for our actions been shifted? If we actually did evolve this way, then our human nature, including the belief in God, our morals and our ethics, and so on, did not have a definite beginning, and instead, it had to have evolved over time. I got the following statements that I'm going to read from an internet site, and they kind of go like this. These are some excerpts from this site. There are lower animals and primates that seem to be able to exhibit empathy or an ability to sense other needs and or feelings. In other words, they're looking at dogs and monkeys and whales and whatever and making this statement. This must, of course, be interpreted as an evolutionary step towards human morals. This could have led, according to their theory, to a notion of attributing purpose to objects such as the development of the supernatural sense. And then selfish behavior of some individuals in a community led to the development of rules that punish those that did not contribute or conform to the given community, the cohesiveness as a assurance of fairness and some social benefit. In other words, the needs of the many started to outweigh the needs of the few. And if you don't know where that came from, it came from Star Trek. That's what Spock said. That's what Spock meant. That's one of the biggest themes in the Star Trek theories, was the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And of course, when you get to, I forget which Star Trek movie it is, the opposite is true. And of course, because of it, yeah,
Star Trek.
Yeah, I'd have to think a bit.
Lost Country or something.
Anyway.
It's the one where Spock dies.
No.
It's the one after Spock dies. His mom asks him that. But yes, you got the right idea.
Oh, wait, the boy's
You're a Trekkie? I did not know that. We're a kindred spirit.
What's James T. Kirk? What does T stand for?
I knew that, but I don't remember.
Tiberius.
That's right.
Tell about how I got
Just a minute. I got to get through this, guys. I don't get sidetracked. Therefore, a rock somehow gains mobility. All right? I've got that one up here right now, that slide. A rock somehow gains mobility. Then electricity and chemistry somehow give the ability to reason and to think. Then this fledgling reasoning ability magically becomes empathy for other rocks. This empathy develops into the most evolved becoming superior. The fittest that survive eventually grow a conscience somehow and use their newly found religious beliefs to make rules to ensure the safety of all the other rocks. Now, this sounds silly. It's very simplistic. They would never tell it to you in this terms, but I'm telling you right now, many people in our government, many people in our educational system, this is what they think. You take a little bit of, like you take a recipe and you put exactly the same amount of sugar and flour and eggs and everything every time you get the same cookies. They are doing this process because of this reasoning to our education, to educating our kids. Okay? And they don't apologize for it because this is their belief system. Or, the other hand, the other possibility is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. George Wald, and I've mentioned his name many times over the last 20, 30 years, won the Nobel Prize in Science the year I graduated from high school. Wald was speaking before a group of scientific atheists when he said this exact same thing. His quote, "When it comes to the origin of life on this earth, there is only two possibilities, creation or spontaneous generation." Notice he is putting it in different terms. He didn't use the word evolution. He used spontaneous generation. There is no third choice. Spontaneous generation was disproved over 100 years ago, but that leads us as scientists, he's talking to scientists, evolutionary scientists, this leads us only to one other conclusion, that of supernatural creation. We, the evolutionists, cannot accept this philosophy on philosophical grounds. In other words, personal reasons. Therefore, we choose, my emphasis, we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. This is an honest evolutionist. This is what they have to believe. Now, can you at a lower level be fooled into thinking something's true that's not? Yeah, but at the highest levels, they have to, at some point, know this statement is true. And he was one that had enough guts to actually come out and say it in a public place. How the universe and all its grandeur got here must be explained. And as Wald says, there are only two possible choices. Whichever choice you make must somehow be substantiated. Over the past 170 years, much of the world has drifted away from the supernatural and decided instead to accept a naturalistic model. That life and everything else that is involved happened by accident from mindless matter. But how we define right and wrong is important. Who has control of moral standards? Is it an all-powerful God, or is it an evolved rock whose electrical and chemical reactions have evolved to a point where, which make it seem like some things are better for society than others, or more importantly, nowadays it seems that some things are better for me personally? When I was in education, an education student at the University of Michigan, the new craze was called values clarification. Anybody ever heard of this? Values clarification is defined as a psychotherapy technique that can often help an individual increase awareness of any values that may have bearing on lifestyle decisions and actions. This technique can provide an opportunity for a person to reflect on personal moral dilemmas and allow for values to be analyzed and clarified. Notice there is nothing in this statement that says this is right and this is wrong, and you need to figure out how to make sure you're on the right side, because that's not in values clarification. In fact, if we go back a number of years to both the 1828 and the 1969 Webster's dictionaries, we get this definition for values. Values as a net worth in the sense that economists speak of price. So, for instance, an apple is worth $1 or 50 cents or whatever. But by 1988, the definition in Webster's changed to a new meaning. And that meaning was social principles, goals or standards, and a person's principles or standards of behavior, one's judgment of what is important in life. Now, the other definition still works, but now it's got an extra definition. How did that come about? That come about with a long chain of events from the middle 1800s and all that happened that we just mentioned in the first several pages of this class so far. This is like a linguistic sleight of hand, like waving a magic wand and poof, in just a few decades, the definition of values went from being all about how much an object is worth monetarily to the types and standards and behaviors that are important to each individual. Therefore, in a sense, values have supplanted ethics and morals. And right and wrong are determined by one's own judgment of what is important to you in your life. Notre Dame sociologist named Christian Smith wrote this book, Lost in Transition. In it, he studied what happened after values clarification had been taught in schools for a number of years. An easy way to see what he found, we're going to take a look at some statements that were made that he got, these statements are in the book, of people that were ages 18 to 23 that were educated under this kind of program. First, I guess what makes something right is how I feel about it, but different people feel different ways, so I couldn't speak on behalf of anyone else as to what is right and wrong. Second, right and wrong are up to the individual. Who am I to say? And third, I would do what I thought made me happy or how I felt. I have no other way of knowing what to do but how I initially feel. A substantial part of the U.S. population has been taught that this is the correct way of viewing these principles. Moral codes. And if there's no higher authority, guys, if chemical and electricity acting on a rock is where all this came from, they're right. And they pursue it in that way. And they're teaching it and regurgitating it back into us in a way that we don't even know they're doing it, convincing us that they're right. And we still think we believe in the Bible. Well, we're going across sometimes according to their principles and don't even know we're doing it. But because of things like value clarification has often been called values obfuscation. In other words, they become obscured, unclear and confusing by many that are against it. That's kind of what it's called. People that are against it call it that. And if you think about it, this is exactly what we are told that Satan did to Eve. What God made clear was made unclear and confusing and evasive by Satan for the purpose of changing God's word. I've got some excerpts from a website next. The website is called How to Determine Moral Principles Without Religion. All right. Many theists, it says, argue that a higher power is the only possible source of moral principles. But modern ethicists, people that study ethics, categorically deny that this is the case. In other words, they say that's not true. If the ideas proposed by a religious text are good, then they are good independent of the speaker. Who's the speaker that they're talking about? Paul? Moses? Jesus? Doesn't matter what these guys say. If it's right no matter what the guys in the Bible say, it's right anyway. They're not basing that these guys said it so it's right. They're saying it's right, so these guys must agree with it. There's a huge difference there. A huge difference. Determining moral principles without religion doesn't mean you can't be spiritual, they go on to say. It simply means thinking through morals on your own instead of accepting them as fact. Consider the most certain principles of your life, the principles that you never violate. This is them talking again. What are these principles and why are they important? And this is their statement to that. For most people, aggressive violence falls into this category, as does stealing and lying. But this self-examination of morals is perhaps the most important step to determine the moral principles without religion. Do you notice the absence of sexual immorality in that statement on purpose? Because this would be one that they don't agree with, but they don't figure that you probably should steal from people or kill somebody. They don't want to tell you where that came from. That came from the norms and the chemistry and electricity that originally came from a rock, not from a higher power. Yes?
You mentioned value verification in that there was certain techniques. What techniques are you talking
I really don't have time to get into that right now. I will discuss it with you later a little bit, but that's actually quite a deep subject. We had complete classes on that sort of thing. Well, I was a shallow person too, because at the time I didn't realize till it was a little bit later when I'd been through some of their indoctrination, I realized how much nonsense it was. Okay? Anyway, good question. We'll talk about it. All right? Morality should not say how we live in our life in order to obtain a better position in the possible afterlife. One can concoct a moral code with many different kind of goals and aims, but it remains that this life is the only one we have. Next, consider the real-world cause of inspirations of amoral behavior. Religions, generally, believe that evil or bad actions are failure of human individuals. We believe that, all right? This guy's agreeing that this is what we believe. He doesn't agree with that it's true, but it is someone's fault as they strayed from the moral tenets of religion out of selfishness, anger, or some internal evil flaw. But most evil acts, according to these guys, are not the result of conscious evil people, but rather the circumstances surrounding them. Ever wonder why they can let a criminal out and not serve his sentence? This is what they believe, guys. Okay? Wasn't their fault. Of course, back in Genesis, God told Cain, sin is crouching at your door. You must master it. They're oppositions. They're totally opposed to each other. Examples would be evil is done in an effort to survive, even if the effort is fundamentally misguided. So a guy like Hitler's actions grew out of a need for the nation to return from poverty to safety and wealth. And Genghis Khan fathered hundreds of offspring, was an evolutionary desire to spread his DNA. Guys, I heard those arguments when I was in college. Okay, state school, yes. Next, the human intellect is the greatest tool that we yet know. Doesn't this go back to the beginning of what we've been talking about? Understand that the presence or absence of a higher power has no effect on moral code. The most highly developed rock is the ultimate source of all knowledge and morality. And that's my words, but it's what they're saying. Finally, note that morality does not come from religion, but from communities who interpret religion. So, like we said above, values have supplanted ethics and morals, and instead, right and wrong are determined by one's own judgment of what is important in life. It is no wonder that the Pentateuch has been in the crosshairs of the skeptics for the last 170 years. The first 5 books of the Bible are where God initially defines himself and tells mankind what his standards of right and wrong are. It is the 10 Commandments, which we will be studying eventually, that were given to Israel as a summation of God's universal principles. This is exactly why the 10 Commandments have been under attack and have been taken down from public display. We are told in the Bible that God is holy, he is righteous, and he is just. That he not only tells the truth, but that he is truth. In other words, the Christian believes that God is the moral standard. And let's look at these attributes a little bit, just very briefly here. So if anybody here doesn't know exactly what I'm talking about, they will. First of all, holy. In 1 Samuel it says, There is none holy like the Lord. There is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. You ever notice that when you read the Bible and the angels are focusing their praise on God, they don't say things like, God is eternal, God is faithful. These are all true. God is mighty. What do they say? Holy, holy, holy. That's what the angels do when they praise God. Righteous. In Psalms, the Lord is righteous in all his ways and kind in all his works. Even Pharaoh, we studied a while back in Exodus, either came to this conclusion or was forced to say, I'm not sure I know which for sure, the fact that his people were, when his people were suffering under the plague, Pharaoh acknowledged the perfect justice of God in pursuing him for his sin when he said, I have sinned this time, the Lord is righteous, and my people and I are wicked. That is not what Pharaoh initially believed. And God is just. Deuteronomy chapter 32. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. This attribute is closely related to holiness and righteousness. God hates sin, and his just nature demands that he judge it. He has given us his law and has declared the soul who sins shall die. Something just came to mind. I'm going to throw it in. Might make me a minute or two late, but there's a famous playwright. Now his name's not coming to me, but it will. He is also an atheist, very staunch atheist. One time he was given a Bible as a gag gift for a present, and he wrote in the front of the Bible, it says, I will never read this book. I have not read this book. I will never read this book, because if I do, I may be convinced to follow its principles, and I do not intend to do so. George Bernard Shaw, thank you. Yes, that was him. It tells a lot when you get down into these people's daily events as to what they really think and why they do what they do, and why we're in the mess we're in. And then we mentioned truth. Psalms. The sum of your words is truth, and every one of your righteous rules endure forever. John chapter 14, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It is the responsibility of every person on earth to seek that truth and acknowledge its existence. And then finally, in this section here, 2 Timothy 2:15, one that probably everybody in here had to memorize as a kid. Present yourselves to God as one approved, a worker that has no need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. The word that's being talked about in 2 Timothy here is God's word. God is the moral standard. He always has been and always will be. Anything else that claims to be morally superior is false. Every person on earth must ask themselves, where did morality come from? The evolutionary model says that morality grew out of necessity over vast amounts of time. If the evolutionary model is correct, then we can never know when it became wrong to murder or to covet or to bear false witness. Under this kind of model, we would not definitely know if any of these things were wrong in every generation and every society, or which parts of our present moral code will change in the future as the rock turned Homo erectus continues to to evolve further over time. On the other hand, the biblical model says that an all-powerful and all-knowing God dictated morality by his own nature, and that it has always been a part of the fabric of existence. What is wrong in the present will also be wrong in the future, and what is wrong today was also wrong over the vast amounts of time in the past. As Hebrews chapter 13 says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday and today and forever. It is this model, the creation model, that we will use to interpret the commandments of Moses that was given by God nearly 3,500 years ago. I believe that God created man to live by a moral code that existed long before he wrote it down on the stones for Moses to take to Israel, and that this moral code existed long before God ever said, "Let there be light." God's moral code has always existed, and what we have in Exodus chapter 20 is simply a condensed version of what God has expected all along. These 10 commandments, or these 10 words that, as they're known in the Jewish writings, were not created just for Israel. They are not arbitrary. They are not developed over time by trial and error. And they were not thought up by a rock through an evolutionary process that was caused by some kind of electrical or chemical stimuli. We have previously stated that the subject of the entire Bible is God. The whole book is all about God. Every page gives us new information about his character and his attributes. What we see in these 10 commandments is yet another insight into the character and nature of the one that wrote this moral code on stone for all to remember. Now, questions? Yes.
I got a comment, no, there's a question. Okay. Good stuff. Thanks a lot for taking the end of my sermon.
Do you realize, you remember how that used to happen to us? I would get up and teach a class, or I'd do a table talk, and then you'd tell me, "Thanks, you ruined my sermon." I don't know if I got a knack for that or not, but I did not know.
No, that's good. It's good that it blends together like that. That's good.
All right. Carry on.
Sure.
Did you have a question?
No, you're gonna believe in something, that's what faith is. Either you're gonna believe in God and have faith, or you're gonna believe that he isn't, and have faith in that. It often does come down to that.
Absolutely. Very true.